Welcome to the presentation on the use of expressive arts in counseling. For this presentation, I have three main objectives. The first one is to give you an overview of expressive arts in counseling. And within this overview, I will be talking specifically about the definition of expressive arts, and I will be also talking about the rationale behind why to integrate expressive arts in the counseling process. The second objective is to give some general guidelines for using expressive arts, for instance, talking about some ethical considerations that you may want to have in mind, as well as guidelines for choosing the expressive art media and some guidelines on how you process expressive arts activities during counseling. And the last objective would be to talk about some specific expressive art modalities, for example, visual arts and collages and paintings, and how those can be incorporated into the counseling process. I would like to start by defining expressive arts in counseling or expressive arts therapy, and I am going to be using the definition provided by the Appalachian Expressive Arts Collective. They define expressive art therapy as the practice of using a variety of media, and in this case, they specifically mention imagery, storytelling, dance, music, drama, poetry, movement, dream work, and visual arts together. And they really highlight the fact that we use them in an integrated way to foster human growth, development, and healing. It is also about reclaiming our innate capacity as human beings for creative expression of our individual and collective human experience in an artistic form. So we believe that we all have the innate capacity to use this way of expressing ourselves in a non-verbal way, in a way that is more artistic, and we can do this through using all different type of media. And in counseling specifically, it can be used this media can be used in an integrated way to make sure that we are fostering human growth and that we are enhancing the counseling process for our clients. The use of expressive arts enhances the counseling process because it offers clients a symbolic means of expressing themselves and a symbolic mean of really engaging in the process of self-awareness, of self-exploration. The fact that expressive arts stimulate all these senses helps clients to get in touch with thoughts and emotions that they may have a difficult time getting in touch with if they were only expressing these emotion verbally. And creative arts in counseling facilitates the establishment of an engaging environment. It helps clients to feel that empowered to be a part of that counseling process in a different way. It does support the healing process, and it does increase its resiliency as clients are able to use the art as a way to empower themselves to create, to make creations that allow for self-exploration. And in many cases, this creation can be taken by a client and be recreated in many different ways, which is very empowering to the counseling process. The use of expressive arts also fosters greater integration of self through engaging all the senses, experiences, feelings, and thoughts. And this happens to an extent because we are actually engaging the right side of the brain when we engage in the use of expressive arts. So we're tapping into our imagination, creativity, and emotional experience. At the same time, processing the expressive arts is engaging the left side of the brain, which is really tapping into our thoughts and logic. So we're really exploring an issue using both sides of the brain, which really helps to integrate more our experience and our perceptions and emotions. So thoughts and emotions kind of being integrated into one. I like this quote, the next quote that is on the next bullet point, because it really summarizes why expressive arts. And the authors state it can be said that creative endeavors offer multidisciplinary ways to give voice to the human internal experience. And I would like to stop there for a second because I think that's important. What we're saying is that when we use expressive arts in counseling, we're helping clients to give voice to the human internal experience. There are things that we can express verbally, and they may not we may not be able to express those things, those emotions, those thoughts as in depth verbally as we can do it when we engage in the process of creating that experience with a creative art media. And when we do that and we make a creation, then this can act as a catalyst for learning about self and the world at large. I think what is important for me here in this last part of the quote is that I see it happening many times with clients where when they are expressing themselves only verbally, they may not be aware completely of how that is coming across or what is happening or their fully integrated experience of the event that they're talking about. But when they put it in an expressive art media and they end up with a product that they can go back to and look at and continue to process as they're looking at, they become aware of a lot of more emotions and thoughts and perceptions that they were not aware of before. So that's the main reason for using expressive arts, is that it allows that nonverbal way of communicating that can really enhance clients' abilities to go to express themselves in a much deeper level and to become aware and walk away from that process being more integrated in processing a certain type of experience. If you are going to use expressive arts in counseling, it is important to understand some principles that guide the use of expressive arts in the counseling process. One is that when using expressive arts, the focus is not on the product that the client produces, it's actually on the process that the client goes through as they're using the expressive art media to create a product. An example would be a client that creates a collage. We can and most probably will continue to process the final product and what came out, but really in that what is more important is to pay attention to what came up for the client as the client was going through that process, because it is in the process of creating that most of the self-awareness and healing can happen. As therapists, we have to be very intentional about creating a safe space for our clients. Again, because expressive arts can tap into the right brain, it can really bring some strong emotions and even at times memories that were not previously that clients were not previously aware of before they started using the expressive arts. And therefore, we have to make sure that we have created a safe therapeutic environment. This is not something that you want to start doing right away in your first or second or third session. You want to make sure that you have created a safe space with your client before you engage, especially with some specific forms of expressive arts, and we're going to talk about that in a few slides. And the other part of this bullet point, it says that as therapists we act as witnesses, and what that means is sometimes when clients are engaging in the expressive arts making, they or creation, they are really engaged in a lot of internal processing, and a lot of internal processing is happening. So we want to honor that, and instead of us being interrupting that by continuously talking to our client, we need to act as witness. We need to be there to be connected emotionally to our clients, to be there to pay attention to what is going on with them, their nonverbal expressions as they are creating, but we don't want to be interrupting that process. So that's what it means to act as a witness. It's important to know that expressive arts, or the use of expressive arts in therapy, is based on humanistic, existential, and phenomenological theoretical approaches to therapy is not as based on analytical or medical model. So again, it emphasizes the importance of the relationship, the fact that the use of expressive arts is just a means of communication that can enhance the counseling process, but it does not substitute for the importance of the core conditions or the value of the therapeutic relationship. This also reminds us that the importance is not on analyzing everything that the client has done or is doing in their creation. Instead of analyzing, the meaning of that creation comes from within the client. The client is the one that is actually being able to say what it meant and what it means, what that final product means for them, and what that process was like for them. So we want to honor that and give that voice to the client and that empowerment to the client. It is important to be aware of the art media that you're using with your clients, because different art media is going to give the client different levels of control over their creation. And I just would like to do a little exercise with you. If you can actually close your eyes for just a couple of seconds, and I want you to kind of imagine yourself doing a drawing with lead pencils, and just kind of get in touch with what that feels like for you. What does it feel like for you to do a drawing with lead pencils and the control? Be aware of the control that you can have over that picture that you're creating. And now, or once you have finished getting in contact with that, I would like for you to imagine the same situation, but instead of using lead pencils, I would like for you to imagine yourself doing that drawing using watercolors. And what does it feel like for you to use that? Does it bring different feelings? Do you feel that you're more in control of your creation when you're using lead pencils versus watercolors? For the most part, usually people say that they are most in control when they're using lead pencils. It gives you a little bit more control about how much you want to put on the paper. Usually it leads to maybe less mistakes than if you use watercolors. That's what this slide is referring to. So if you look back at the slide, to understand that at the top of the list we have the type of expressive media or art media that can give clients more control. The more control a client feels over the art media, the more that they're in touch with their left brain and the less that they're in touch with their right brain. And the more that you start going down, you start getting to some media where there is less control, and the less control the client have is more in touch with that right brain and those emotions coming up. So you want to be aware of when you're introducing expressive arts, you may want to really start with the list starting up and going down, or at least offer some of the first couple of expressive art activities that you offer a client could actually be offering different media, but make sure that they also have some of the media where they have the most control over, like colored pencils, crayons, also puppets or model magic. So as you start going down, you can see that you can start using and integrating other art media where the client may have less control over. This is going to vary depending on your client and your clinical judgment. Only you can decide what your client is ready or not ready to engage in. I think it's important to talk to your client about their comfort level. Some people feel really comfortable using sand and they love doing sand trays, and some clients really don't feel comfortable touching sand, and it actually doesn't bring a relief. It actually creates more anxiety. So you want to make sure that you know your client, that you have these conversations with your clients, and that you are aware of the type of media that you're using and how much control your client is having over that media. In these next two slides, I would like to talk to you about the different levels of processing. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to follow this or that this is, you always start, usually you start with level one, but it doesn't mean that you always go level two, three, four. It really means that this is just kind of like a guideline for you to follow if you want to use expressive arts and you're not used to it. And then you can find your own style and your own way of using it, and that's going to also be influenced by your client. So as just as a general guideline, usually we consider kind of level one, where you're just encouraging your client to describe or share his or her creation. And that can be as simple as tell me about your drawing or tell me about your sand tray, allowing the client to be able to actually come up with what it means. Again, coming from a humanistic perspective and getting away from that analytic perspective. So we don't want to be analyzing what our clients are doing. We want our clients to be empowered to have a voice to describe. The next level is when you actually share your own observations with your client. So in that processing, you can tell your client as a reflection, I noticed that the lion seemed mad at first and then sad that the other animals wouldn't play with him. And so this is an example that you may use with a adolescent that just created a sand tray. And in this sand tray, they may have recreated something that happened in the school. And so being able to actually just go back and reflect to your client some of the observations that happen when either during the creation time or as they're expressing and engaging in processing their final creation. Level 3 processing is when you, as the counselor, invite the client to enter into the metaphor that they have created or chosen. And an example of this would be, I wonder what it would be for you to identify with the child in that picture. So if a client just created a collage and there is a picture that they seem to really identify with, then level 3 could be asking them to what is it like to identify with that, or if they could put themselves and be that child in that picture, what would that look like, or what brings up for them. And level 4 is encouraging the client to reflect on their creation and personalize that metaphor. So if they have a very strong reaction to a character in a story or to a song, to be able to say, what is it about that song, that character that reminds you, does that remind you of somebody else in your life or of you in a different moment in your life? I want to just say that for me, I think level 3 and 4 come naturally. It doesn't really, I don't personally lead my client there because I'm coming more from a humanistic perspective, and so they're there for you. But in my experience, what happens is as I allow the client to and empower the client to have that uh, control over their processing time, and they're the ones in control of processing what is meaningful to them, that for me to just stay in level 2 of reflecting what I am able to also feel in the moment and to observe in the moment helps clients to naturally get to level 3 or 4 if they have a need to go there. And I said this so that you are careful not to go there too quickly, because your client may not be ready to actually be able to enter the metaphor or to personalize. Part of using expressive arts is allowing the client to have some distance and to be able to represent something outside. And so they may need some more time, or even they may need to process and do some other creative art products before they can actually get into personalizing that for them. Depending on the age of the client too, that personalizing is actually happening. Usually for adults it happens faster, but if you're dealing with a younger teenager, for instance, like a pre-adolescent, they may not have actually the cognitive ability yet to integrate that and to understand that meaning. So asking questions that leads them to level 3 or 4 can actually be anxiety provoking or leave them with this feeling of like I really don't know what you're referring to. That's not what I was in that moment when I was talking to you about this. So be aware and be careful, and use these kind of processing levels as just guidelines, general guidelines that I would just emphasize use your clinical judgment, and you know your clients better than anybody, so you can get to decide what feels right. I also want to highlight some ethical considerations that we want to have when using expressive arts. One is the first one, and the most important, is client welfare. We have to make sure that we are competent in any type of in using any type of expressive arts that we want to use. So um, this presentation kind of gives you, my hope is that it if this is something that you want to do in your counseling, that this presentation can serve as a way for you to get motivated, to get the right training to be able to do it. I personally, anytime that I use an expressive art material, I make sure that I have experienced it myself, but also especially for more advanced type of expressive art material like Sandtray, like the use of Sandtray in therapy, I go and obtain a lot of more training from experts, and you can do a lot of these trainings in different counseling uh, conferences that happen, like the American Counseling Association or the Association for Play Therapy is another one where you can get a lot of training during their annual conference on the different type of expressive arts in counseling. So I really want to highlight that the fact that it is expressive arts, and that I'm actually going to touch on some of the most common ones and the ones that maybe most people are able to engage in, as counselors, they're able to do it more easily. I want to highlight that we really need training, and we need to make sure that we are having the right training before we come in into our sessions to try something with clients. Another part is confidentiality. So we want to make sure that we keep confidentiality, and when we're using expressive arts, the images and the final products that our clients come up with are part of the confidentiality process. So how are we, if we're staying with those, then how are we keeping those in our clients' files and protecting them and making sure that they're not being, that nobody else is taking a look at them. I also need to talk again about the importance of familiarity with the art forms and their power, because it is very important that we become very familiar with the media that we're using. Some media can evoke really powerful feelings, and we want to make sure that we're not just taking by surprise when that happens with our clients. So I always think it's a good practice for, if you want to do something with a client, that you should experience it yourself. And so not only go to the proper training and get training on it, but also experience what it's like to do that, and to use that media as a way to engage in more self-awareness. Know that there is a potential for the arts experiences to move clients between different states of consciousness. So they can go from being very literal to being at a place where it's very emotional to imagining. And this makes expressive arts not be appropriate for clients who are experiencing psychosis or other type of breaks with reality. So want to make sure that you assess for that, and that if you have a client who that you are actually making sure that you're not using it with clients that are not appropriate for the use of expressive arts. Supports clients in applying the metaphorical to the literal world in which they live, and so we have to make sure that as clients are making that connection, that we're helping them through that process. I think what is important here is always be aware of time and how much time you have with your client, and some expressive art creations are going to be able are things that are able to be done in one session, and then do you have enough time at the end of the session to process? If they're taking more than one session, then talking to your client about that process and what that looks, and then how much time do you need maybe at the end of the session to at least process with your client, to have enough time to process what they were able to do up to that point, and then pick up next session when they come back. And it's important not to pathologize approaches to the images. So it's all about the client's meaning, and we trying to stay away from, at least from a humanistic perspective, and that's if that's where you're coming from, that you're not using their creations and their images to be to diagnose or to pathologize what they're presenting to you. Visual arts is one of the most used media when incorporating expressive arts in the counseling process. Doing things like drawings, painting, and collages are examples of different visual art media that you can use. The use of visual art allow clients to express images, feelings, and thoughts through colors and shapes. And just as a reminder that the medium you use for the drawing determines the level of control the client has over their creation. So again, whether they're doing something with lead pencils or with watercolors, will make a difference in their level of perceived control over the process. I would like to highlight that when I do a lot of the expressive arts, when I introduce them to clients, I always like to end with saying, and the final product doesn't have to make sense to anybody but you. Using similar words to make sure that the client understands that it's not important if they're doing a drawing or a painting, that it's not important whether that painting or drawing makes sense or it has to be literal about what they're thinking. What is important is that they feel free to express themselves in any way that feels natural to them and that feels that is helpful to them at that moment. So, always helping clients to understand that, because I think one of the challenges in using expressive arts is many times clients feel I'm not creative enough, or even for us as counselors, sometimes we feel like I'm not creative enough, like I'm a really bad painter. I don't know, and I don't do good drawings, and so for me, getting to the point where I feel comfortable using drawings or painting as one of my media to express myself at the beginning was a challenge, and it was a process to get used to it and to understand that at the end it's not about the final product, it's really about the process and what happens in that process, and to be able to allow myself that permission to be creative in the way that feels right to me, and it doesn't have to make sense to anybody but myself. So giving that permission and that freedom to clients is important to make sure that from the beginning we are helping them to overcome that challenge. If you decide to use visual arts, this is a model that you can use to help you maybe come up and conceptualize what type of activities you're bringing to the session for your client. So this model actually looks at the counseling process and breaks down the example of the type of visual art activities that we can do at the different stages of counseling. It talks about the first stage being the entry stage, or that stage where we're really just getting to know our clients and establishing a safe relationship and understanding the presenting issue of the client. And in this case, things like draw something that represents you, your family, the problem that you're bringing in, your presenting issue. Draw a story about your marriage. That could be a way to help the client to just present the problem. Again, you don't want to do this right away. Ideally, you would like to wait until you have at least created some safety in that relationship. But it would be important to then start at this level if you're still kind of exploring with your client the presenting issue and what is coming up for them. This could be a good way to get there. Then, as you move into the exploratory process in the counseling process, and you can then do activities that relate more to that. So, draw how you see yourself before and after this event that you're talking about. So, a client that is getting divorced, you may say, let's use the materials in the room for you to draw how you saw yourself before the divorce and how you see yourself now. Or draw what divorce looks like to you, just in general. If the goal is to explore that feelings associated with the event itself. So you have to be, I guess, intentional about what is it that you want your client to get out of this, and this needs to be based on your conceptualization of your client and your clinical judgment about what your client is ready to engage in during the process. And finally, the last stage of this model talks about action taking. So if you have moved to that part of the counseling process where the client is actually looking at engaging in some new behaviors or is changing things, making choices about how they deal with things, then you could actually use this media as a way to help them explore that. An example would be draw yourself 15 years from now. What goals will you need to reach to get there? So once they have drawn themselves and they see themselves visually where they want to be in 15 years from now, processing with them what needs to happen to get there. And another example would be create a collage representing how you can communicate boundaries in your relationship with your partner. So if you have a client that is having relationship issues with a partner, helping them to maybe put into images what putting boundaries in that relationship may be like for them. Again, the whole idea is that when they express it in that way, that they're exploring this issue in a way that allows them to engage that right part of the brain, which is allowing them to get in touch with emotions and also to have a much more in-depth understanding of the issue once they allow themselves to go through the process of creating and using expressive arts in counseling. Another widely used expressive art media in counseling is the process of bibliotherapy or using books, and really that whole process of using books in counseling in a therapeutic way is defined as bibliotherapy. It's important to understand when we use books in the therapeutic process that it's not just the reaction that the client is having to the material. Instead, what we really need to pay attention to and to be focusing on is on the interactive process, whereby the reader becomes part of the unfold process of the story. And and this can be that the client is reading a book and then processing what is coming up for them as they are in this story and how that story relates to them and to what is going on in their life. Or it could be that the therapist bring a specific book into the session and reads, or they reads part of the story and helps the client then to process what that process was like for them. The therapist tries to help the client to understand what is being communicated by facilitating activities to help them engage with the book. Here is where you can actually integrate other expressive art media. And so it could be that a client has just finished reading a story, is processing, and then to process what came up for them out of that story, you can use a collage or a drawing so that they can express that process and process what came up for them through another expressive art media. And this brings us back to the beginning of the presentation when I explained that the definition of using expressive arts in therapy talks about integrating the arts and using one and building one upon the other one to really allow the client to explore issues from many different perspectives. And so this is part of where you can do some of these. If you're using bibliotherapy, you can use other creative art activities to help the client to process their experience of bibliotherapy. And association with characters and plot help clients release emotions, develop insight, and find new ways of interacting with the world. The idea is that at the end of the use of bibliotherapy, because of that processing that has happened and the client has been able to process their interaction with the characters, with what happened in the story, that is going to help them to develop more insight and find new ways of behaving and acting in the world around them. In general, bibliotherapy can help clients to provide new information. So, in a way, it can actually be used to provide new information to clients. If a client is trying to make sense or is going through the grieving process, for instance, and is really trying to cognitively understand more what that grieving process is, reading a book that helps to explain that process may be helpful for clients. It encourages insight because if clients are reading this story, it provides enough physical distance that they don't have to automatically personalize it, but at the same time can gain that insight into perhaps what that the character in the story, how that person is acting, and how that's different from how they're acting in this situation. It stimulates deeper dialogue, being able to bring that process into the counseling session and process with your clients their interaction with the story, with the characters, with the plot of the story, or even if it is a short storybook that you're just reading, 5 minutes in session and then talking about what that brought up for that client can really help to get that dialogue to be deeper and help the clients to explore the issue at hand in a different way. It normalizes life events, so many times clients may feel that they identify with the issues that a character is exploring in the story, and that kind of normalizes their own experience of the event that they're going through. And it provides potential solutions, especially if the story is actually ending on a positive outcome, or the character in the story is exploring different ways in which they can deal with things, then that provides clients with ideas on how the client himself or herself can do things differently, and how they can engage in different behaviors that could possibly lead to a different outcome in their lives. The following steps serve as a guidelines for us to think about how to integrate bibliotherapy in counseling, and things to be aware of on what that process looks like. So the first one is the identification. We need to be thinking and conceptualizing what are the clients presenting concerns, and is bibliotherapy right for this client, and really even having a conversation about how comfortable they would feel using this as one of the media to process the presenting issue is important. Then once we also conceptualize that, then we're able to make a more targeted selection of the type of books that we want to bring in. You really need to have a rationale and an understanding of why you are suggesting a specific book, and sometimes the selection can happen where you as the counselor come up with it. It could be that you and the client actually talk about, come up collaboratively with maybe a book or a story that you want to read, or it could be actually the client that brings it up and talks about the one a book that they are currently reading and that is meaningful to them, and it naturally kind of happens in the session. Once you have decided on that book and what you're bringing in, then it's important to think about the presentation. How is the material going to be read? Is the client taking this material home? Is it like a longer book that the client then is kind of going through and processing as things come up, or is this uh, short book that can be read during session? And if that's the case, who is reading the book? Is it the counselor reading it, or is it the client reading the book to the counselor? So thinking about this and what makes sense for the goals that you and your clients have for the counseling process is important. And then it's important to then don't forget about follow-up, processing through the either activities or discussion what came up for your client. And so again, here is a really good opportunity for you to integrate other expressive art media as a way to integrate it all and help your clients to process deeper what came up for them throughout the bibliotherapy process. There are many other different type of creative or expressive media that you can use and bring the expressive arts into your counseling process. So we don't have time to go over all of those other media, and I just wanted to highlight a couple that I feel are again used widely by some therapists. The first one being Santray. And I would like to read the definition. It's an expressive mode of psychotherapy that involves the unfolding and processing of intrapsychic and interpersonal issues through the use of Santray materials as a nonverbal means of communication. It helps it helps the clients to really represent with miniatures within the confound of a Santray their experiences, their perceptions, their emotions about the events that they're processing. And it can be very powerful. It is one of the media that is that a lot of adolescents in particular seem to like a lot, and pre-adolescents. And just actually playing with the sun or having your hands in the sun can bring a lot of different emotions to people. So you can see how this is one of those media that is a little bit on the less control. For the clients, they don't have as much control over these media as they do over other media. And with Santray, you can also go with just dry sun or wet sun. This would be one where if you're interested and you are not trained on it, I highly encourage you then to seek formal training. There are actually entire university courses dedicated to how to conduct Santray with clients. So it's something that needs more training and understanding of the process. The next one I wanted to bring up is music, and there are actually people who specializes on music therapies and have license to practice music therapy. For most counselors, if they're not music therapists, they like to at least bring music as a way of incorporating a different media, and this can happen in many different ways, but for this definition, it says music therapy facilitates the creative process of moving toward wholeness in the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual self in areas such as independence, freedom to change, adaptability, balance, and integration. So again, for some people, they specialize in their music therapies. If you are not specialized, but you would like to use music and incorporate music as one of the communication media that you use with your clients, then I highly encourage you to go to specialized training and workshops that can help you to understand better the whole process of using music. But with music also comes the use of dance, and even just musical instruments into the counseling session, and it can be very, very powerful. Music is a very powerful media, and it evokes a lot of powerful emotions for most of us. And so you want to be careful and be ready and feel that you're competent in how you're bringing that media into your counseling process. And another one that I have seen used quite a bit is clay or materials similar to clay. And in this case, I took this one brief definition of the use of clay in process, and it says it's the process of handling, manipulating, and sculpting clay and the products of these activities, meaning the products of handling, manipulating, and the sculpting. And I myself have used this before with clients, and I find it to be very powerful. It's not every client feels comfortable manipulating clay, so that's something that you want to be aware of and making sure that you are um, talking to your clients about their level of comfort around clay. But if they do and they like it, it can be very powerful. And with clay, the fact that they can actually create something and then recreate it, and then kind of like at the end go back and continue to mold that, can be very that part can be very empowering and powerful for the clients. And again, it's one of those that if you don't have experience and you haven't had any training on it, it would be important to look at some books and workshops and things that can help you. There are some articles out there that talk about the specific use of clay in psychotherapy. And so it would be good for you to um, gain some more knowledge about how to use it and what are best practices around using clay in the counseling process. To end this presentation, I would like to just highlight some points that I have made throughout this presentation. The first one is don't be afraid to experience art and to engage in the creative process. I know that we grow up with a lot of, for some of us, not everybody, but for some of us, we grow up and we internalize very early on that, oh, you're not a good you're not good at drawing, you're not good at creating with art, and we internalize that as being something that then brings shame and makes us feel like that's not for us. And I just want to encourage you, if this is something that you want to do and this is something that takes your attention, not to let that to stop you from learning more about it and from trying it and experiencing it, and kind of like overcome the challenge by not being afraid to go there and to play yourself and and do things yourself with creative art media, so that you get back in touch with that innate capacity that we all have to do that. If you want to integrate expressive arts in your counseling process, make sure that you're seeking educational opportunities to become competent in using expressive arts in counseling, and make sure that you are aware that there is a difference between being a licensed expressive arts therapist or music therapist versus being a counselor or a mental health professional that integrates some of that media into your counseling. And make sure that you're following all of the ethical guidelines that you need to follow within your profession. Seek clinical supervision from clinicians that have experience using expressive arts in the counseling process. Make sure that if you are going out there, getting educated and getting some extra education on this topic, and then you're getting ready to start trying it in your counseling process, that then you could actually get some clinical supervision, even if it is peer or mentoring supervision, but from somebody that has the experience and that can serve as someone that you can process what this is like for you and what things are coming up. Remember that the process of engaging in expressive arts is one that is empowering to the client, or at least it should be. And so, while it's not, it can be painful and it can bring very deep emotions. The actual process of going through it and creating something and recreating is something that at the heart of it is really empowering to clients. And so I think not losing sight of how we as counselors are helping to enhance that empowering process and not to take away from it. And how do you do this within your own theoretical orientation? How do you integrate the arts within the conceptualization that you have of your client? In other words, be intentional. It's not about just like 5 minutes before your client comes in, choosing something to do with your client. This should be a very thoughtful process where you're really conceptualizing your client, your understanding from your own theoretical orientation, the issues and what your client is dealing with, and then based on that conceptualization, you're choosing and targeting very specific expressive art media that you feel could be beneficial to your client. So, how are you doing that in a way that is empowering and that it doesn't take away from the counseling process is very important. And don't forget that relationship is by far the um, most important agent of change in the counseling room, and that using expressive arts does not in any way take away or should not be taken away from the importance of the core conditions in the counseling relationship. With that said, I hope that you enjoyed the presentation and that you took some learning points from this, and even um, perhaps you're now ready to try some of the more accessible media that is out there and that is commonly used, like the visual arts. And that's why I really wanted to emphasize that one in this presentation, because I feel that's a good place to start if you don't have formal training on the use of expressive arts. So collages and just drawings could be a safer way to start experimenting with some of the expressive arts in counseling. Thank you very much for your attention.